So friends, today we will be discussing the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. East Europe is turning into a theater of war. And who are the main actors on the stage? The first is Russia, of course. Second, Ukraine. And the third is Nato, which essentially is United States. What is Nato? We'll discuss it during this particular lecture. Why has this crisis emerged in the first place? The main reason for the emergence of this crisis is Ukraine wanting to be the part of NATO. It has still not become the part of NATO. NATO has still not accepted it, but Ukraine desires to be the part of NATO, and that is what is bothering Russia. Traditionally, if we see, so Russia and Ukraine have been close to each other. Traditionally, Russia and Ukraine have been close to each other. They have long historical, political, spiritual, cultural ties with each other. Russia and Ukraine for many years were part of the same kingdom that was ruled by the Tsars of Romanov family. So in the last century, these two were part of the Tsarist empire. Ukraine and Russia, along with Belarus, another country of East Europe, form the core of Slav countries. What are Slav countries? These are the countries in which the population of Slavic people, Slavs is the ethnic group. So these are the countries in which the population of Slavic people is of considerable number. So Ukraine and Russia, or Russia and Ukraine for that matter, as we see, have traditionally been related to each other. They have had good connections with each other. Both of them are also Christian countries, and hence we can see religious togetherness also. Then what is the problem? Then what has led to this particular crisis where Ukraine wanting to join NATO has pushed Russia into sending 1 lakh of its military personnel to the border of Ukraine. The situation is such that the world fears that a war will now happen. Will the war happen? We don't know, but we hope the war does not happen. From where does this story start? From where does the story of rivalry between Ukraine and Russia start? Does it start in 2021 when Russia started sending its forces to the Ukrainian border? Or it starts in 2014 when Ukraine pressurized its president, who had Russian backing, to resign and flee? No. The story actually starts with something called as the Cold War. We will actually go into the detail of this crisis. We will historically examine this crisis. We will not just focus on what is happening today. We will see how this crisis has historically evolved. Now, what was the Cold War? Cold War was the rivalry between two camps. One led by USA and other led by USSR. USA, as we know, is United States of America. USSR, on the other hand, was Soviet Union. The full form of USSR is Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This was a supranational entity. What is supranational entity? Supranational entity is when more than one country, or we can say when two or more countries come together and form a political alliance, and that political alliance gives sovereignty. It gives sovereignty to the entity that they have formed. So 15 countries came together and formed the Soviet Union. 15 countries came together and they formed the Soviet Union, and this particular entity now had the authority to decide on behalf of these 15 countries. On paper, all these 15 countries were free to take decisions on their will. But in reality, it was the USSR who took decision for the whole block of these 15 countries. This particular entity or this particular association, if we may call it, was dominated by Russia. It was dominated by Russia. Why? Because Russia was the birthplace of this particular organization. From Russia, the idea of USSR emerged. First thing. Second was, Russia was the biggest country in this bloc with respect to economy. Its economy was the biggest. With respect to population, and also, and most importantly, with respect to area. Because Russia was biggest with respect to these three aspects, Russia had a disproportionate influence on the other countries of the bloc, which also included Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine was the second largest country in terms of economy and in terms of population. Area-wise, Kazakhstan was the second largest country in USSR. But if we take into consideration economy and population, so Ukraine was the second biggest country. Moving back to what was Cold War. Now this was all about USSR. We don't need to get into much details. For this particular topic, whatever we have discussed, that will suffice. Now let us go to Cold War. What was Cold War? So as I told you, this was the rivalry between USA and USSR. Two blocks. One block believing in capitalism and democracy, and the other block believing in communism and one-party rule. These two blocks rivaled against each other for domination over world affairs. They wanted to bring more and more countries under their influence. They wanted their way of life or their style of governance to be accepted by more countries. This particular rivalry did not get converted into actual war. Because of two reasons. First reason was the destruction that had caused by the Second World War, and second reason was something called as MAD. MAD का full form है, the full form of MAD is mutually assured destruction. Both these entities, USA and USSR, had nuclear weapons, and because they had nuclear weapons, none of these two countries attacked each other, because they knew their war will get converted into nuclear war, which will lead to large catastrophe. It will not only have impact on these two blocks or these two entities, the impact of this particular war will be on the whole world. This rivalry continued from the time Second World War ended. Some say that the rivalry was present during Second World War also, but we will consider that this particular rivalry started from the end of Second World War. Why from the end of Second World War? Because in Second World War, these two entities were together against their fight, were together in a fight against Germany. So after Second World War, this Cold War started. These were the two blocks. This Cold War rivalry continued till the year 1991. This rivalry continued till the year 1991. And this particular year is very important in world history. In fact, the date 25th December 1991 is very important in world history. It will always be remembered in world history. Why is that so? Because on this date, USSR collapsed because of various reasons. There are a number of reasons. When we do a lecture series on USSR or world history, we'll talk about it. On 25th December 1991, USSR, because of various reasons, broke down. The 15 countries which were under USSR declared their independence, and they now did not have to listen with respect to their foreign policy or internal policy decisions. They did not have to listen for the diktats from USSR. So 1991 USSR breakdowns, 15 new countries have been established. The biggest of these countries is of course Russia, and Russia now is started recalibrating its foreign policy, because at this point of time Russia needed money. Okay. Russia, once it got out from USSR, it needed financial resources to stabilize this economy, to stabilize its economy. These financial resources, of course, were in the hands of United States and the two institutions that United States has great power upon. These institutions are IMF and World Bank. So Russia, for the purpose of stabilizing its economy, and for the purpose of getting itself out of the recession, tries to mend relations with USA. It tries to mend the bad relations that is had during the Cold War with USA and began a new chapter through which Russia could now get financial resources that are necessary for it. Russian foreign policy at this point of time adopts a strategy called as Atlanticism. What is Atlanticism? Atlanticism is Russia moving closer to West, Russia moving closer to US and its allies for the purpose of getting financial resources, as I had talked. Now this particular policy was followed by Russia from 1992 to 1996. During these 6 years, Russia moved away from its traditional allies and started moving towards the West. These were also the years when Russia in a way moved away from India, and moved closer to Pakistan, because Pakistan has been the traditional ally of the West. It has been the traditional ally of United States. By the time Russia knew that this particular friendship or this particular attitude of Russia towards US and its allies is not working, 4 years had passed. In the year 1996, when Russia was assessing, when Russian foreign policy makers and the Russian president at that time, Boris Yeltsin, were assessing the successes and failures of overall policies they had taken up from the time of breakup of USSR, they realized Atlanticism has not worked. In fact, what had happened was Russia's status in global affairs had drastically reduced. Why? Because the world saw Russia to be one of the allies of US, not an independent foreign policy maker, not an independent entity, but an ally of US. Did Russia get the benefit? No. As I said, it did not get the financial benefits from the West that it expected. Russia therefore moved to a policy of Eurasianism. Moved to the policy of Eurasianism. What is the policy of Eurasianism? Eurasianism ka policy, the policy of Eurasianism simply means Russia will have good relations with West. It will not run after West, but it will have good relations with West. But it will concentrate its efforts on something called as near abroad. What is near abroad? Let us get into what is near abroad. Not let us get into, we will just have a cursory understanding of what is near abroad. Near abroad means that Russia will have good relations with those countries which were formerly part of Soviet Union and also those countries with which Soviet Union had good relations. For example, India. So Russia moved back to its friends and moved back to those countries which were part of Soviet Union. Russia decided that it will keep intact the influence that it has on its neighborhood and on its friends. With respect to US and the rest of Western countries, it said, okay, we will have good relations with them, but we will not concentrate our energy on them because it is of no use. We will on the other hand concentrate our energies on our allies, and we will see to it that we have the same influence, or we can say almost the same influence that Soviet Union had on its allies. In this particular concept of near abroad, as I said, Soviet countries, the countries which were part of Soviet Union were included, and those countries were included which had friendly relations with Soviet Union. With respect to those countries which were part of Soviet Union, Russia had an added advantage. Russia had not interfered in the matters of these countries for 4 years, from 1992 to 1996, 5 years. But then, even after the lag of this time period, Russia could still influence these countries. Russia could still make these countries navigate their foreign policy towards itself. Russia could still have a say in what these countries will do, both internationally and domestically. Why was that? There were 3 reasons for it. First was that Russia was the largest economy in that particular region. In the Eurasian region, okay, what is Eurasia? A small term. What is Eurasia? Eurasia is the landmass which constitutes both Europe and Asia. When we study foreign policy, there can be different meanings of Eurasia. As I said, geographically Eurasia means the landmass that constitutes Europe and Asia. But when we study foreign policy from the point of view of Russia, Eurasia means that area that was once under Soviet Union. As far as foreign policy from the point of view of Russia is concerned, Eurasia means that particular landmass which was once under the occupation of Soviet Union. So, Russia in the Eurasian region still was the largest economy. The other countries depended on Russia for financial resources. They also depended on Russia for supply of raw materials, as a market for their finished goods, and also to a certain extent financial assistance. So Russia in that way still had a say over the countries of former Soviet Union. Russia also has influence over these countries because of Russian speaking people in these countries. During the time of Soviet Union, people could travel in these 15 countries without any restrictions. And because they could travel in these 15 countries without any restrictions, they could search for employment opportunities anywhere in the Soviet space. Soviet Union also made sure that in different areas, Russian people were made to stay so that the regional people or the natives of that particular place do not rebel against Soviet Union. So what we saw as a result of this was Russian speaking people spread across the Soviet space. First was the employment opportunity, because of which they traveled to the different parts of Soviet Union. Second was the Soviet government itself making sure that Russian people stay in different parts of Soviet Union so that the natives of that particular place do not rebel against the Soviet government or Soviet system of government. Hence we see Russian speaking people in large quantities, in large numbers in different countries of the former Soviet Union. Third reason is, in fact, in some countries or in most of these countries, Russian is the second most spoken language after the native language of that particular country. Russian is the second most spoken language, and in almost all the former Soviet countries, Russian is one of the official language. Alright. The third reason is the politicians, civil servants, and military officials. The politicians, civil servants, and the military officials of the erstwhile Soviet countries received their training, their education in Russia. Hence, they have a very close bond with the Russians. In fact, many of the politicians, many of the civil servants, and many of the military officials in these countries belong to Russian speaking families. And because they belong to Russian speaking families, they have a soft spot for Russia. These three reasons made it possible for Russia to continue to have influence over the space that it called its near abroad. How was its relations with West during this point of time? Not bad. The relations with West were not bad. In 1999, when this policy was still in existence and it was still followed, it is actually still followed today. There came another personality to the stage, and his name was Putin. Vladimir Putin. an ex-KGB official. KGB was the intelligence unit of Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin becomes the president of Russia. In 1999-2000, he becomes the president of Russia. After becoming the president of Russia, he starts well with United States, has good relations with United States, also starts well with the Soviet Union, Soviet countries, pre-Soviet countries. He starts well with those countries who were part of Soviet Union. What was his individual thinking about the Cold War, or what is his individual thinking about the Cold War and the status of Russia? Vladimir Putin thinks that dissolution of Soviet Union or collapse of Soviet Union is the biggest blunder of the last century. He comes to office with the idea of regaining Russia's position in world affairs that it had during the Soviet Union. In the beginning, as I said, he has good relations with West. He has good relations with those countries who were part of Soviet Union. But slowly and steadily, as he consolidates power at home, he also tries to enhance the position of Russia in the global affairs. This he starts by something called as Russian-Georgian War of 2008. Georgia is the country which was part of Soviet Union and is located in Caucasus. It is located in the geographical region called as Caucasus. Now, Caucasus is the range of mountain that are located between Caspian Sea and Black Sea. Georgia puts forward the ambition to align more and more with the West, align more and more with United States. This Putin sees as a problem. He sees that decision to be encroaching upon the near abroad of Russia. He feels that this particular region, the region of Eurasia, the region of Russia and its neighbors who were part of Soviet Union, to be the area of influence where the writ of Russia should run large. He considers this is the area that should be left to Russia so that Russia is guaranteed about its military defense. He considers the countries who were part of Soviet Union in that particular area, the countries who were part of Soviet Union in that particular area to remain under the influence of Russia or not go into the military influence of West countries to keep Russia safe. He does not trust the West. He does not trust the West when they say that inclusion of former Soviet countries in Nato is not against Russia. He does not trust the West when the West says that Nato is not anti-Russia. He wants Russia to have its own buffer zone, and that buffer zone are the near abroad countries, the countries that were earlier part of Soviet Union. It is not as if the former Soviet Union countries have not joined NATO. There are Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, which are part of NATO, but then they in a way joined NATO when Russia's influence in world affairs was considerably less. After the breakdown and collapse of USSR, when the influence of Russia in world affairs was considerably less and Russia did not have that kind of say in world affairs, at that point of time these countries had joined NATO. In 2008, when Russia had started regaining, Russia had started consolidating its power back, Putin did not allow this to happen. He saw to it that Georgia does not go towards the West. The same was actually the case with respect to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, like any other former Soviet country, had been under the influence of Russia for a long time. In fact, most of its presidents, there were not too many, but almost all of its presidents were Russia leaning. Almost all of its presidents had a leaning towards Russia, and they therefore obstructed the integration of Ukraine, economic integration of Ukraine with the West. Now, this was something which went against the popular demand. Ukraine, economically, if we compare it with Asian countries, so economically it is a prosperous country. We can say economically it is a prosperous country if you compare it with the Asian countries. But otherwise, Ukraine was not growing economically, and it depended too much on the limited resources that it had. The economy of Ukraine was not diversifying. The economy of Ukraine was not getting the advantage of globalization. There was less job creation in Ukraine, which frustrated the youth. And also, there was a problem of corruption. This particular evils of Ukrainian economy forced the people of Ukraine to pressurize their government for better economic integration with the European continent, to get advantages of the advancements that Europe had achieved. The response of the government of Ukraine was negative. The president of Ukraine in 2013, that is Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, rejected the demand of the people for better integration with Europe. What did the people do? They started protests against their own president, and the protests were very intense. Russia wanted Viktor Yanukovych to continue as the president of Ukraine. Why? Because he was Russian leaning. He did not want Russia to move towards, he did not want Ukraine to move towards West. On the other hand, people wanted it to happen. This situation, as I said, led to protest, and these protests were so intense that the president had to flee. The president had to abdicate power and leave. He did not actually abdicate power. He said, I am still the president. All right. Every fleeing president does it. He first resigns, he goes to some other country, and then he says, I have never resigned. The resignation was by force, so I have never resigned. Now, what this particular situation did was, it created a series of events which made Ukrainian government pro-West. It made the Ukrainian government pro-West. This means now, after many years, or we can say for the first time, West will have, or United States and its allies will have decisive influence on the policy making of a former Soviet republic. Of course, we have talked about the Baltic states, but leave them aside for a few minutes because Ukraine is too close to Russia, and hence influence of the West on Ukraine is considered to be more detrimental by Russians to their national interest. Once Ukraine got pro-West government, the Russian speaking people in Ukraine now started protesting. We have seen that the former Soviet countries have huge number of people who historically belong to Russia and still speak Russian language. These Russian speaking people in Ukraine now started protesting. They believed that the change in power is detrimental to their interest. Russia, therefore, taking this into consideration, annexed Crimea. Crimea is a peninsula. It was part of Ukraine, and it is a peninsula located on the Black Sea. It has, in Crimea, you have majority of Russian speaking people. So in Crimea, you see majority of Russian speaking people. Russians, therefore, in 2014, went into Crimea and annexed Crimea. There was no fight from Ukraine because Ukraine knew that it cannot withstand the military might of the Russians. The Ukrainian assembly approved this particular annexation of Russians of Crimea. Once this particular event happened, what it inspired was violence by Russian speaking people in East Ukraine. Now, East Ukraine again has sizable Russian speaking population. And why does East Ukraine have sizable Russian speaking population? Because it is in East and to a certain extent on North that Russia borders with Ukraine. Hence, that particular region we see more Russian speaking people. So once Russia annexed Crimea, this gave hope to Russian speaking people in other parts of Ukraine, especially eastern Ukraine, and that to two territories. And these are Donetsk and Luhansk. Violence therefore grew. Thank you. Thank you. Violence therefore grew in this particular area. People of these two areas, as I said, wanted these regions also to be taken up by Russians. Russians did not directly annex these two areas. The situation in Crimea was different. Crimea is important to Russia also because of strategic reasons. Crimea has the port of Sevastopol. This particular port is the only port where through which Russians have access to Black Sea. So because of strategic reasons, Crimea was important to Russians. Hence, annexation of Crimea was it was as if everyone knew that will happen. Everyone knew that will happen. It was not a news. It was a news, but it was not such a news that it came as a surprise. Everyone knew that will happen because Russia could not afford to give up Sevastopol. With respect to East Ukraine, Russia did not have any such strategical reasons to invade it. It did not have any such strategical reasons to take up the area of Eastern Ukraine and go more against the West and worsen its ties with the West. In fact, when Crimean issue happened, what happened was many countries of the West, including United States, or primarily the United States, imposed economic sanctions on Russia as a country, and many Russian officials, ministers, bureaucrats, military personnel. Now, what are economic sanctions? Economic sanctions are when one particular country makes it difficult for others to trade with the third country. For example, if United States has imposed sanctions on Russia, that means it becomes difficult for other countries to trade with Russia. United States will not allow its financial institutions. United States will not allow the financial institutions over which it has influence to facilitate that trade. All right. So that is what economic sanctions is. And United States itself will not economically transact with these countries or with this person, will not allow their land or their financial institutions to be used to transfer money to this particular country or this particular personnel. That is economic sanctions. So when Crimean crisis happened, at that point of time, economic sanctions were leveled by United States, and there were other countries also, but primarily by United States on Russia and many high-ranking officials in Russia. So Russia did not want to deteriorate the situation. They did not want to take it further. But they could not leave the Russian speaking people on their own. So what they did was, or what is said to be done by them was, they supported the Russian speaking people through resources, both money and other resources, and by shelling the eastern part of Ukraine, so that Ukrainian military does not dominate this area. So Russia did not directly participate in the East Ukraine crisis or in the East Ukraine issue, but what it did was, it supported the Russian speaking people of East Ukraine by providing them with resources and shelling the East Ukrainian region, so that Ukrainian army does not have dominance over the territory of its eastern part. What has this led to? It has led to huge loss of debt. In fact, the most conservative figures say that in East Ukraine, in these two regions, the casualties have been around 10,500. Around 10,500 people, according to the most conservative figure, around 10,500 people have died since 2014. All right. So this is overall the background to what is happening today. Russia and Ukraine are staring at each other. Of course, Russia is staring more aggressively because of its resources. They are staring at each other, and both are wanting to move in opposite directions. Ukraine wants to be the part of Nato and hence is moving in that direction. Russia does not want Ukraine to be part of Nato because that will mean American personnel in the backyard of Russia and American military resources in the hands of Ukrainians, which would be detrimental for the strategic and military future of Russia. Russia, hence, since October 2021, has been gathering forces on the Ukrainian border. Russia, therefore, has been gathering forces on the Ukrainian border. These forces, according to some estimates, have reached 1 lakh to 1.5 lakh. So there are around 1 to 1.5 lakh Russian military personnel on the Ukrainian border. This is problematic for Ukrainians because they do not have such a strong army. If tomorrow Russia attacks Ukraine, Ukraine cannot defend itself on its own. One more thing that is bothering Ukraine is its location. Suppose this is Ukraine. If this is Ukraine, then this is Russia. And this is Belarus. Belarus is an ally of Russia. The president of Belarus, Lukashenko, is very close to the president of Russia, Putin. And Lukashenko will do as he is told to do by Putin. In fact, there are Russian forces in Belarus also. Hence, what we see is Ukraine has Russian forces on its border from 3 directions. From Russia, from 2 directions, in 2 directions from Russia itself, and from 1 direction from Belarus. Ukraine, therefore, is strategically trapped. What has it done? It has called for help from the West. The West has in fact proposed peace talks, and peace talks have been happening. Peace talks have been happening since 2015. Before this particular issue started, peace talks were happening. I'm sorry I missed that. So there were something called as Minsk Accord. There was something called as Minsk Accord. What was Minsk Accord? Minsk Accord was actually a treaty which has almost been finalized, but it has not been implemented. And that treaty, and the parties to that treaty were France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. This particular talks that took place in Minsk concentrate on maintaining peace in East Ukraine. The agreements, the term of agreements are, there will be ceasefire in East Ukraine. Everyone will sit where they are. Therefore, Russians will not cross and get into Ukraine. Second is, there should be withdrawal of heavy weaponry. Heavy weaponry is with Russians. Ukrainians do not have that good weaponry. They have good weaponries. They do have good weaponries, but not as good as the Russians. And third is, Ukrainian government will get full control of East Ukraine. Alright, so the rebels will give up their weapons. These terms have been agreed, but they have not been executed. So Minsk Accord as of today is only on paper. Minsk Accord as of today is only on paper. Alright, I'm sorry I actually missed this particular point, hence we had to go back. I'm sorry for that. Ukraine also accuses Russia of cyber attacks. Ukrainians also accuse Russia of cyber attacks. The most notable was NotPetya cyber attack. Of course, Russians deny it. Russians have not confirmed it. Russians have denied it. West has been pushing for a political solution. Russia has also shown its willingness to have a political solution. Even Russians are not, they are preparing for war. They are posturing aggressively. but they also do not advertise that they want a war. All right. The countries involved in this particular dispute have been meeting, but they have still not come to a final conclusion. They have still not come to a final conclusion. The chief bone of contention, as I have said, has been the chief bone of contention between the two has been Ukraine's decision to join NATO. Russia does not want to allow that. Russia does not want that to happen. There are other demands also by the Russians. We will talk about the other demands also, but they are only incidental. They are not primary. They are not the demands on which the solution to this particular problem depends. Other demands are removal of NATO troops from Poland. Poland was not part of Soviet Union, but it was part of the East Bloc. So what was East Bloc? So there was Soviet Union with 15 countries, and there were other countries which were not part of Soviet Union, but their alliance was towards Soviet Union. So Poland was not part of Soviet Union, but it was part of East Bloc. So Russia wants, and Poland is Poland is neighboring country of Russia. Russia does not want NATO troops in Poland. They also do not want NATO troops in Baltic republics. These two things are not going to happen. All right. NATO troops have been in Poland and Baltic countries for a long time now, and these two demands anyway will not happen. They also want withdrawal of nuclear warheads from the Baltic countries. They want the withdrawal of nuclear weapons from the Baltic countries because Baltic countries now are part of NATO. So NATO guarantees them security, and because NATO guarantees them security, what NATO does is they place their weapons in these particular countries. They have placed these weapons in these particular countries, including nuclear weapons. NATO, I have been speaking of this particular term, NATO. What is NATO? If I explain it to you in 2 minutes, so NATO is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is alliance of those countries which after the Second World War were fearful of Soviet Union. So it is alliance of those countries which had a common enemy, and that is Soviet Union. All right. At this point of time, or we can say always, United States was the leader of NATO. NATO basically is if someone attacks one of the countries which is part of NATO, everyone will attack that country. It is a strategic military alliance. Decisions of NATO are mostly taken by United States along with France and Britain to a certain extent, but essentially they are taken by United States. So when we say withdrawing nuclear weapons of NATO from Baltic countries, they essentially mean withdrawing nuclear weapons of United States from the Baltic countries. This again is a demand that Russia knows cannot be fulfilled because nuclear weapons in Baltic countries are there in those countries for a long time now. And last, as I said, withdrawal of and last demand, as I said, or the primary demand as we know, is Ukraine not joining NATO. Now, there has been what we can say a stalemate. Stalemate is not the right word. We can say the discussions are not moving forward at this point of time. And because an obstruction has been now hit, the world and these countries are looking for their support. We are looking for support from other countries and other groups. What is the attitude of India? What is the attitude of India towards this particular situation? Recently, what India did is it issued a statement which said that all parties involved in this particular dispute should sustain efforts for a long-standing peace. it means, what it essentially means is, India wants these two countries or all the countries involved in this particular dispute to keep talking and arrive at a peaceful settlement. India therefore through this particular statement also showed that it will not side with any country. Why is it so? The reason for that is, even if Russia is one of those countries with whom we have friendly relations, we also have good relations with Ukraine. We also have, we can say, not bad relations with Ukraine. With respect to Ukraine, government of India or governments, successive governments have not, we did not have any concentrated policy on Ukraine. Alright. So we cannot say that we have bad relations with Ukraine. We do not have as much good relations with Ukraine as we have with Russia. Alright. So we can say that the relations with Ukraine are not bad. They are good, but they are not as good as India has relations with the Russian government. But Ukraine is essential to India because of military supplies. Why is it so? Most of the defense equipment that India uses is of Soviet era, or it comes from Russia. During the Soviet era, the Soviet economy was placed in such a way, the Soviet economy operated in such a way that one particular industry was not concentrated in one particular area. Suppose if the Soviet Union had to make a cupboard, so what they will do is, they will manufacture steel at one particular place, they will assemble the cupboard in another particular place. Suppose if they manufacture steel in Russia, they will assemble the cupboard in Ukraine, and then they will paint the cupboard in Kazakhstan. Why was it so? So that not one particular region, no one particular region could get economic superiority and think about moving out of USSR. So what they did was, they created a condition in which all the regions of Soviet Union were dependent on each other for production of any commodity. With respect to all the commodities, they applied this formula. With respect to defense also, they applied this formula. Hence, if manufacturing of defense was taking place in Russia, spare parts of the defense products were manufactured in Ukraine. So when we got our defense products from USSR, the defense products that were manufactured in Russia, we had to look to Ukraine for their spare part supply or military supplies. Hence, Ukraine is also important for India. We cannot also totally disregard Ukraine, because at this point of time, Ukraine is sitting close to the West, and India has been undertaking the policy where it has enhanced and it is enhancing its foreign, diplomatic, military, economic relations with the West. So India at this point of time is not taking any sides, and it should not take any sides. What it should do is, it should maintain equidistance, and it should hope that the situation, that the countries come out of this crisis with the solution that gives peace. What about UN, United Nations? Now see, the problem with respect to this crisis is, or the problem with respect to any crisis which goes to UN is 5 permanent members. It is the veto that is carried by the 5 permanent members. What is the veto? If any of the 5 permanent members, that is US, Russia, France, UK and China, these are the 5 permanent members of United Nations. If any one of them wants to stop a decision that is made by the rest, then even that one country can stop that decision. So veto is when I restrict the organization from taking any decisions. Now what has happened over here is because US and Russia are both part of this permanent members, both of them have vetoes. And because both of them have vetoes, both are not wanting to budge. Both are not wanting to go back. And because both are not wanting to budge, United Nations is not able to arrive at any particular decision. United Nations therefore has continued to be an onlooker as it is in most of the events. I am not criticizing the UN, but it might be a question for next year with respect to UN, because in most of the crises what the world feels or what the countries involved in crisis feel is United Nations does not take any decisions. United Nations just acts as an onlooker. So this particular policy of United Nations has also been criticized, and this particular policy of the United Nations is not of any help in this particular crisis. I hope this particular lecture was good enough for you to understand this particular crisis. As the crisis develops forward, as the situation, we do not want the crisis to develop forward. As the situation develops, we will keep looking into the issue and we will keep talking to you about the issue. Let us see what happens. We hope the war does not take place and there is some peaceful negotiation and peaceful peace. Thank you.